Eva and Miriam, Moses's mother, asked whether it was a good thing that her daughters were twins. It was May 1944. They had just stepped off the train onto the ramp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and an SS officer was moving among the separated families, dividing people into two lines with a flick of his finger that determined who would live through that afternoon and who would not. The officer stopped in front of 10-year-old Eva and Miriam, identical to her even in the way she held the hem of her skirt. He asked whether they were twins. Their mother, not knowing which answer carried greater weight, said yes, hoping it was the right word. The officer nodded. The girls were immediately separated from their mother and their two older sisters, who disappeared that same afternoon toward the gas chambers. Eva never saw them again. She and Miriam remained on the other side of the line, among the group Josef Mengele reserved for himself. Eva and Miriam's convoy had taken 4 days to arrive from Romania, 80 people packed into each railway car, with no water and no container for human waste beyond the single bucket that had already overflowed by the second day. When the sliding doors opened on the Birkenau ramp, light flooded in all at once, along with shouted German commands that no one in the car fully understood, SS dogs straining at their leashes, and air heavy with a sweet, burnt smell. The girls would not learn to identify until much later. Open suitcases, family photographs, baby clothes, and other belongings lay scattered across the ramp, objects their owners had carried for days believing they would need them, and which guards were now stacking to one side for later sorting. An officer walked along the newly formed lines with his hands clasped behind his back, pausing in front of each family only long enough to decide its immediate fate, while other prisoners, already dressed in striped uniforms, carried the abandoned luggage toward a nearby storage area without meeting the eyes of the new arrivals, an unwritten rule that everyone working on the ramp seemed to know in advance. The cry repeated across the ramp whenever a convoy arrived was brief: Zwillinge, heraus, twins, out. The guards learned it through repetition, and the prisoners working on the platform learned it by hearing it over and over, because it meant that an SS doctor with doctorates in anthropology and medicine needed pairs of genetically identical bodies for his research. And Auschwitz, with thousands of deportees arriving every day, was the only place in the world where that human material appeared in industrial quantities. Mengele had arrived at the camp in May 1943 at the age of 32, and in less than a year had turned the selection of twins into a procedure as standardized as the extermination system surrounding it. Between May and July 1944, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews arrived at Auschwitz within 8 weeks, the fastest and most concentrated deportation campaign of the entire Nazi extermination operation. From each convoy, the overwhelming majority of children under 14 were sent directly to the gas chambers on the day they arrived, without registration, without prisoner numbers, without leaving any administrative trace that they had ever existed. Sometimes several trains arrived on the same day, and the Birkenau ramp, expanded that same year specifically to absorb the volume, operated with a logistics system that SS officers themselves later described as comparable to a factory at peak production. Within that system, twins were the only category of children with a real chance of surviving more than a few hours after stepping off the train. And that chance depended entirely on whether an officer identified them in time and whether Mengele happened to be keeping his selection program open that day. Before Auschwitz, Mengele had worked at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt as an assistant to a geneticist named Ottmar von Verschuer, an internationally recognized specialist in twin research who believed that twinhood was the key to separating heredity from environment with mathematical precision in the formation of a human being. Under Verschuer's supervision, Mengele had written a thesis on racial influence in the formation of the lower jaw and had left the institute with a second degree and a recommendation describing his work as exceptional. When Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943, his relationship with Verschuer did not end. They continued corresponding regularly, and in 1944 Verschuer himself informed the German Research Council, the institution financing his Berlin Institute, in writing that his former assistant, then a medical captain at a concentration camp, was sending him genetic material from the camp's most diverse racial groups with direct SS authorization. That material consisted of blood samples, tissue fragments, entire organs, and, in cases of heterochromia, eyeballs removed after the subject's death. The Berlin Institute catalogued each shipment as though it were material from conventional fieldwork. In his official correspondence with the German Research Council, Verschuer referred to Mengele as his former assistant and formally expressed gratitude for the collaboration made possible by Mengele's position in the camp, without a single objection appearing anywhere in that correspondence about the origin of the samples or the fate of the people from whom they had been taken. Mengele's main laboratory occupied part of the sauna building behind Block 32, a brick structure that theoretically served to disinfect prisoners' clothing but in practice housed examination tables, a microscope, dissection instruments, and an improvised refrigerated area where blood and tissue samples were stored before being packed for transport to Berlin. Shipments left the camp with relative regularity, in wooden boxes lined with ice whenever the journey allowed it, accompanied by the paperwork necessary to pass through the Reich railway system without any transit officer opening the containers for inspection. Mengele personally checked the packing before the boxes left the laboratory, making sure the labels matched the corresponding case numbers exactly, an administrative meticulousness that stood in grotesque contrast to the brutality of the procedures that had produced the contents of each box. Every container carried a label with its case number, the same numbering system Mengele used on his measurement files, so that a jar containing a pair of eyeballs could be linked without ambiguity to the child from whom they had been removed months or years earlier. Between May 1943 and January 1945, an estimated 1,500 pairs of twins passed through Mengele's hands at Auschwitz, most of them children and adolescents deported from Hungary, Poland, and the territory that had once been Czechoslovakia. Of those roughly 3,000 individuals, fewer than 200 were still alive when the war ended. The figure, revised by historians after 1945 using surviving partial records and testimony collected from survivors themselves, remains approximate because a substantial part of Mengele's archive was destroyed before the Red Army reached the camp. Historians who later worked with the surviving fragments agreed that the real mortality rate among the twins, even excluding those who died from causes unrelated to the direct experiments, far exceeded that of any other prisoner group that had received relatively privileged treatment within the camp system. In June 1944, while trains from Hungary were arriving faster than the gas chambers could process them in a single day, Mengele was promoted to chief physician of the entire Birkenau camp. The promotion did not change his personal routine on the ramp. He continued appearing at every major arrival, his uniform immaculate, white gloves on his hands, directing people left or right with his index finger at a pace survivors later described as mechanical, indifferent, almost musical. Sometimes he whistled fragments of classical music while carrying out selections, a detail independently mentioned by several witnesses in later testimony, as though deciding who would go to the gas chamber and who to the labor barracks required no concentration at all. He is estimated to have personally participated in selecting several 100,000 people who were sent directly to their deaths during that period. Among that multitude, his ear remained trained to catch a single word capable of changing the immediate fate of whoever spoke it: twins. The twins who were selected were not sent to the gas chambers or to forced labor blocks. They were taken to a separate barracks within Birkenau's hospital sector, where they received slightly better rations, were allowed to keep their hair, and in some cases retained part of their own clothing. The improved conditions were not compassion, they were equipment maintenance. A sick or malnourished twin disrupted the variables of an experiment, and Mengele needed his subjects alive and in sufficiently comparable condition long enough to complete each series of tests. Eva and Miriam were taken to that barracks on the same afternoon they arrived. The examinations began the next day. They were stripped and measured for hours, using the same instruments European physical anthropology had employed for decades to classify skulls, spreading calipers to measure the width of the nose, graduated measuring tapes for cranial circumference, and printed color charts containing dozens of numbered shades to determine the exact hue of each girl's irises, comparing the left eye with the right in search of even the slightest variation: arm length, skull circumference, distance between the eyes, ear shape, exact iris color matched against reference charts. The results were entered on forms that were later sent through regular correspondence to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity and Eugenics in Berlin, where one of Mengele's former academic mentors evaluated the material as though Auschwitz were simply a research branch of the institute. Once the measurements ended, the injections began. Eva sometimes received as many as 5 separate injections in a single day, unidentified substances injected into her arm, while an orderly recorded the reaction on a form attached to her anthropometric file, so that any physical variation observed during the next measurement session could immediately be compared with the substance and dose administered the week before. One of those injections gave her a fever that brought her close to death for nearly 2 weeks, during which Mengele, as she would recall decades later, visited every day to observe her without intervening, commenting aloud on how many days she had left to live. The twins' barracks operated with its own hierarchy within the larger camp system. An appointed capo kept records of who had to report each morning to the examination block, arranged the lines according to age and sex, and beat anyone who was too slow getting out of the bunk. The wooden bunks, stacked 3 levels high, held 2 or 3 children in spaces designed for one, and the packed earth floor became covered in frost during the winter nights of 1944, when temperatures fell far below freezing and there were not enough blankets to cover everyone. By 6 in the morning, before the first roll call, the children had already learned to distinguish from the sound of boots in the corridor whether the day would begin with measurement, examinations, or something worse. When the laboratory needed to move a group of children from the gypsy family camp to the sauna building where Mengele had installed his equipment, the vehicle that collected them was, on several occasions documented by camp hospital personnel, a truck bearing the Red Cross emblem on its sides, the same symbol that everywhere else in Europe was supposed to guarantee protection and aid. Other routine procedures in the barracks left no immediately visible marks. Some twins underwent lumbar punctures without anesthesia, a long needle inserted between the vertebrae to extract cerebrospinal fluid, a procedure that even in conventional medicine at the time was generally performed with sedation because of the pain involved, but which, in Mengele's barracks, was carried out by physically restraining the screaming child. Others had metal clamps tightened around their limbs for hours, with the stated aim of studying the progression of gangrene produced by prolonged compression. Children subjected to this procedure were left with blackened skin in the affected area and, in several cases documented after the war, suffered partial loss of function in the limb even if they survived the camp. The bacterial cultures used to deliberately infect one twin from each pair were prepared in the same sauna laboratory, grown in dishes that an assistant checked daily until they reached the concentration Mengele considered suitable for injection. The procedure did not vary according to the subject's age. A 6-year-old child received the same dose calculated for a 15-year-old adolescent, adjusted only according to an approximate body weight that Mengele estimated by sight. Renate and René Gutmann underwent a different procedure on an examination table separate from the children with clamps attached to their limbs. One of the sisters was strapped to the metal surface with leather restraints before an assistant made an incision in her abdomen with a scalpel, without any explanation of the purpose of the cut. Then came the injections, which in her case caused not fever but immediate vomiting and diarrhea, symptoms recorded by an orderly in a notebook with the same indifference a factory worker might use to record the output of a machine. Neither sister ever learned, not even after the war, what substance had been injected into them that afternoon. Between examinations, the children in the barracks developed their own ways of caring for one another, methods no adult had taught them. The older children learned to recognize from the capo's tone of voice during roll call whether the day would include painful procedures and quietly warned the younger ones so they could prepare themselves mentally before being taken. From their bunks, they shared the extra rations they received as research subjects with children left too weak after a procedure to get up and eat on their own. And on winter nights they took turns sleeping in the middle of the shared bunk, where the body heat of the others offered some protection from the cold, leaking through the cracks in the wood. In another corner of the same barracks, a Hungarian teenager named Efrem Reichenberg waited beside his twin brother. They had arrived in July of that year, after 3 days locked inside a cattle car with 75 other people. On the ramp, the same shouted command had separated them from the rest of their family. When Mengele examined them, he noticed a difference that immediately caught his interest. One brother had a clear, trained singing voice, while the other had been hoarse since childhood. The asymmetry between two bodies that should have been identical was, within Mengele's genetic framework, valuable data. He decided to intervene directly on both brothers' vocal cords. The procedure involved injecting a substance into the front of each brother's neck, at a point first marked with ink by an orderly before Mengele himself inserted the needle, comparing one brother's reaction with the other's aloud as though he were reading the results of 2 laboratory samples. The reaction was immediate: swelling, high fever, vomiting, and complete loss of voice for days. Ephraim received the injection again every 4 or 5 days for more than 3 months. During some sessions, his brother became unable to swallow for long periods and had to be fed by other means, while his body recovered enough for the next round. The injections continued without interruption until January 1945, when Mengele disappeared from the camp as quickly as he had arrived, leaving behind an incomplete archive of experiments that he himself would help destroy in the following days. Not every pair of twins in the barracks shared a bunk with a biological sibling. Leopold Lowy, a Jewish boy from Berehov who had lost sight of his actual twin sister in the chaos of selection, was administratively paired by the SS with another boy, simply to complete the registry of twin pairs Mengele required. The other child was Kalman Baron, and during the months they spent together in the barracks, undergoing examinations and blood draws neither fully understood, they formed a bond that survived their later separation during the evacuation of the camp. They lost contact for more than 5 decades. In 2000, Baron, by then living in Israel, saw a television documentary about Lowy returning to Auschwitz and immediately recognized the face of the boy with whom he had once shared a bunk. The telephone call he made that same night was their first conversation since 1945. 2 years later, they met in person for the first time since liberation, a reunion both described as recovering a part of their childhood they had believed lost forever, along with everything else the camp had taken from them. While this was happening in the twins' barracks, another train arrived at Birkenau from Hungary, carrying a family that interested Mengele for a different reason than twin genetics. They were the Ovitz family, 7 siblings from a Jewish musical troupe in Transylvania, 6 of them with hereditary dwarfism, traveling with relatives of average height. Mengele had them separated from the rest of the transport as soon as they were identified and ordered special accommodation built for them inside the camp, with better hygiene and food than the other prisoners received. Because the family represented something no eugenics textbook had ever been able to study in such detail. A single bloodline producing both average height and dwarfism within one complete traceable family tree. The Ovitz family were forced to parade naked in front of SS officers gathered in the camp dining hall while Mengele explained his theories about the hereditary nature of physical abnormalities. Then the tests began. Bone marrow was extracted. Teeth and clumps of hair were pulled out in search of hereditary markers. Boiling water and ice-cold water were alternately poured into their ears to measure nervous system response times. Chemical drops were placed in their eyes until they were temporarily blinded. SS gynecologists examined the married women in the family with a degree of thoroughness none of them could later explain in any medically reasonable terms. The youngest member, an 18-month-old baby named Shimshon, born to average-height parents within the same family, became the subject of greatest interest. Mengele ordered blood drawn from him every day, from veins behind the ears and from his fingers, until he became so weak he could barely hold up his head. Before the clinical tests began, Mengele demanded something else from the family. He wanted to see them perform. The Ovitz siblings had been professional musicians before the war, known in Transylvania as the Lilliput Troupe, and Mengele arranged a performance for a group of SS officers gathered in the camp dining hall. The siblings with dwarfism climbed onto a small improvised stage and played the instruments they had managed to keep during deportation, while Mengele explained to the uniformed audience the hereditary traits that, according to him, accounted for the stature of the musicians before them. When the performance ended, the officers' applause gave way to the order to undress for the first examination. The family members of average height were forced to carry their siblings with dwarfism in their arms to the room where Mengele was waiting with instruments already arranged on the table. According to testimony Elizabeth Ovitz herself gave decades later, one of the officers present that night approached after the performance to ask for an autograph on an improvised program, as though he had just attended an ordinary variety show rather than the prelude to a series of forced medical examinations on an entire family. Of the 10 members of the Ovitz family who arrived together at Auschwitz in May 1944, all 10 were still alive when the camp was liberated 8 months later, an outcome virtually no other family of that size arriving during the same period could match. Their collective survival was explained precisely by the scientific interest Mengele had in keeping them intact as a complete study group. Mengele's obsession did not stop at the structure of the body. It extended to eye color. Among the camp prisoners were people with heterochromia, whose irises were different colors, and Mengele believed that if he could artificially alter iris pigmentation, he might demonstrate mechanisms of genetic control applicable within his reasoning. to the racial superiority preached by the regime. His method involved injecting methylene blue dye directly into the eyeball, almost always without local anesthesia, while an assistant held the child's head completely still so that movement would not ruin the precision of the needle. In most cases, the result was not a change in color but a severe infection that caused extreme pain and, in several documented cases, permanent blindness. When an injection failed to produce any usable result, Mengele ordered the entire eyeballs removed after the subject's death and sent them, packed and labeled, to the same Berlin institute, where an eye pigmentation specialist named Karin Magnusson added them to her collection for comparative study. Magnusson had worked with rabbits before Mengele began supplying her with human subjects, and she catalogued every case by file number. One such file, registered as number 842, contained a detailed clinical drawing of the heterochromatic iris of a Roma child, commissioned specifically by Mengele to document a color that the black and white photography of the time could not capture accurately. In addition to the prisoner pathologist forced to carry out autopsies, Mengele also kept a small group of female prisoners with medical or nursing training as permanent assistants in the sauna laboratory. They restrained the youngest children during blood draws, prepared syringes with whatever doses Mengele ordered without being allowed to ask what they contained, and cleaned the examination room between subjects. Several of these women survived the war and later became crucial sources for reconstructing the laboratory's day-to-day operation because, unlike the children being examined, they understood the medical terminology Mengele dictated aloud while working and could accurately name what they had witnessed. One later testified that the hardest part of her work was not holding children down during blood draws, but watching them return to the examination line week after week, each time a little thinner, knowing she could not warn them about what was coming without risking her own life. Not all of Mengele's surgeries pursued a specific genetic question. Sometimes the intervention seemed driven purely by curiosity about the limits of the human body. Moshe Ofer arrived at Auschwitz with his twin brother Tibi in 1944, and for months both were subjected to a series of operations with no apparent connection to one another. One operation on Tibi's spine left him permanently paralyzed in both legs, an injury no camp surgeon attempted to explain or justify to the boy himself or to his brother, who could only watch from the neighboring bed as Tibi lost. Within days, the ability to stand that he had possessed before. Weeks later, with no recorded explanation, surgeons working under Mengele's orders removed his sexual organs. Before that second operation, Tibi had spent weeks dragging himself along the barracks floor because no one provided crutches or a wheelchair, and the other children in the block took turns helping him reach the latrine, an act of mutual aid that neither the kapos nor the SS doctors bothered to stop, perhaps because it did nothing to alter the result Mengele expected to obtain. Moshe, the brother who survived, carried for the rest of his life the memory of watching his twin deteriorate operation after operation, none of them serving any recognizable medical purpose, not even within the distorted logic that governed the rest of the barracks. Tibi did not survive the last of those procedures, and Moshe reached liberation as the only one of the two brothers able to describe, decades later, what had been done to them on that operating table. Behind Crematorium 2, in a brick building prisoners called the House of Death, Mengele had access to a workspace no other camp physician possessed, a dissection room equipped with marble tables, complete surgical instruments, and shelves filled with jars of formalin, all requisitioned from civilian hospitals before the war. To operate it, he needed a trained pathologist, and he found one among the deportees themselves. Miklos Niesli, a Hungarian physician trained in forensic pathology in Germany, arrived at Auschwitz in May 1944 and was immediately selected when he identified himself as an autopsy specialist. Mengele kept him alive, housed separately from other prisoners, and fed with rations from the SS kitchen in exchange for carrying out the dissections he ordered and preparing reports in the German medical terminology expected by the institute in Berlin. Niesli's workday usually began at dusk, when Mengele finished his hospital rounds and arrived at the House of Death carrying a list of names and prisoner numbers written in a leather notebook. Niesli prepared the table, laid out the instruments according to the requested type of dissection, and waited for the bodies, which in most cases were still warm when they arrived. Mengele dictated his observations aloud while Niesli transcribed them, sometimes stopping to compare an extracted organ with the corresponding organ from the matching twin, placed side by side on the same marble table. twins who had exhausted their usefulness for an ongoing experiment were not returned to the general camp population. Miklos Niesli, the prisoner physician forced by the SS to assist Mengele with autopsies, described one night when 14 pairs of twins were brought one by one into a room adjacent to the crematorium. Mengele personally injected chloroform directly into their hearts. Death was almost instantaneous. The objective was not the execution itself, but to preserve the bodies in a condition as close as possible to the state immediately before death, so that comparative autopsies of each pair could reveal anatomical differences that death from disease or starvation might have. Distorted. When one twin died naturally from typhus or dysentery before a study was complete, Mengele ordered the surviving sibling killed immediately in the same manner so that both bodies could be dissected in parallel and their organs compared under equivalent conditions. Niesli also documented cases in which Mengele transfused blood from a sick twin, deliberately infected with typhus or dysentery, into the healthy sibling to observe how disease spread between two organisms he regarded as genetically identical. The symptoms followed a pattern Niesli recorded repeatedly. Fever climbing above 40 degrees Celsius within hours, delirium, hemorrhagic spots beneath the skin, and in cases of typhus, a rash spreading from the torso toward the limbs, as the child lost the ability to recognize people nearby. Most of these pairs died during the process. One first from the original infection, the other later from the contaminated transfusion. Post-war testimony, and Niesli's own account, also describe what was perhaps the most extreme attempt in Mengele's catalogue, surgically joining two twins along their sides, sewing tissue and blood vessels together in an effort to recreate, in reverse, the separation of conjoined twins. A prisoner nurse working in the children's block later described how two boys around 4 years old, whom she cared for and had grown particularly attached to, were taken away one afternoon on Mengele's orders and returned the next day with their backs joined by surgical sutures and their wrists tied together to prevent them from pulling apart the bandaging. The wounds became infected almost immediately. The smell of gangrene filled the barracks that same night as the two boys screamed, while the nurse could do nothing for them, until their mother, herself a prisoner in the camp, somehow obtained a dose of morphine by means she never wished to explain afterward and ended her children's suffering herself. The experiment produced no data Mengele considered useful. One survivor, in testimony collected after the war, described a case that went beyond even the genetic framework Mengele claimed to pursue. An adolescent girl whom he forcibly impregnated using reproductive material from one of the male twins under study, with the stated objective of observing whether the resulting child would also be a twin. When the birth came and the newborn was a single baby, Mengele ordered the infant killed immediately, leaving no medical record of any kind because, within his logic, the experiment only mattered if the result confirmed the original hypothesis. The girl survived childbirth and the rest of her time in the camp, but for years after liberation she avoided discussing the episode, even with other survivors from the same barracks, mentioning it directly only when a researcher collecting post-war testimony specifically asked about pregnancies in the experimental sector. In Birkenau's Gypsy family camp, the section where Reich authorities had for a time decided to keep entire Roma families alive before eventually liquidating the sector completely, Mengele found another phenomenon he documented with the same clinical interest: noma, a gangrenous disease of the face that particularly affected malnourished and immunocompromised children in the camp. Noma destroyed facial tissue within weeks, opening the cheek, eroding the gums, and exposing the jawbone while the children remained conscious throughout the process. Mengele ordered every case photographed with clinical precision, catalogued the progression of the lesions, and, in a turn, his own collaborators later described as incomprehensible given the rest of his behavior, actively treated some of the affected children not out of any compassion documented in the sources, but because a treated and recovered case of noma provided a comparison point as valuable to his files as a terminal case. The photographic protocol Mengele imposed for noma always followed the same order: a frontal image of the entire face, a profile photograph from each side, and a close-up of the worst affected area, with the child's jaw held by a gloved hand so the camera could capture the exact depth of the destroyed tissue. The photographs were filed with the date, prisoner number, and number of days since the first visible lesion. Natural light was always used, usually near a window in Block 22 because the sector's electrical generator could not provide enough power for a studio lamp. The photographer, Another prisoner assigned to the task eventually learned to calculate the time of day when sunlight entered at the angle Mengele preferred for his comparative series. When a child died from the infection before the planned photographic sequence was complete, Mengele ordered the corpse preserved long enough to photograph the final stage of the lesions, an instruction Naisli himself had to carry out more than once in the house of death. A Polish secretary assigned to the hospital in the Gypsy family camp later recorded a scene that occurred repeatedly along the sector's main street, a group of kindergarten children walking in a line. And when they saw Mengele approaching, several would run toward him, shouting "Onkel, Onkel, Onkel, Onkel," while he stopped to speak to them, asked about their day, and sometimes pointed out 2 or 3 for an assistant to quietly separate from the group and place in his vehicle, without the other children yet understanding that this improvised selection in the middle of the street meant much the same thing as the cries "Willinge heraus" on the ramp. The same secretary later remembered that on more than one occasion the children chosen that day to board the vehicle waved goodbye to their companions, convinced they were going to visit their favorite uncle rather than to an examination from which some of them would never return. In the same Gypsy family camp sector where he documented cases of noma, Mengele had ordered the construction, as early as the summer of 1943, of something found nowhere else in Auschwitz, a kindergarten. Barracks 29 and 31 were plastered on the inside, unlike most other camp structures, and between them a playground was installed with a carousel, sandbox, and swings visible from the sector's main road. Hundreds of Roma children up to the age of 6 spent much of the day there under the supervision of prisoners appointed as caregivers, while Mengele used the space both as a permanent reservoir of research subjects and as a display piece. When delegations or inspectors visited the camp, the kindergarten with its brightly painted swings could be used to suggest that conditions in the Gypsy sector were less brutal than they really were. To decorate the interior of the barracks, Mengele ordered a young Czech prisoner named Dina Gotlibova, deported from Terezin and trained in drawing, to paint a mural of children's storybook characters on the kindergarten walls. Dina painted a landscape featuring Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, asking the children themselves what other figures they wanted included. The assignment, apparently harmless, took a different turn weeks later when Mengele summoned her again for another task. He wanted oil portraits, rendered with clinically precise skin and iris colors, of adult Roma prisoners with heterochromia, or other physical features that black and white photography could not reproduce with the chromatic accuracy his studies required. Dina agreed, knowing that refusal meant immediate death for herself and her mother, and spent months painting people who, in most cases, had already been murdered by the time the portrait was finished. She worked with skin samples and photographic fragments Mengele gave her, along with precise instructions about the exact shade to reproduce in each iris, and more than once had to repaint an entire portrait because the color she mixed did not match the one Mengele remembered seeing in person. When the war ended, Dina had survived because of the work the assignment had bought her, though for decades she avoided speaking publicly about it, aware of the discomfort involved in explaining that she had survived by painting for the man who was killing the people whose faces she portrayed. The protected existence of the kindergarten and its swings ended in a single night. During the night of August 23, 1944, the SS completely liquidated the Gypsy family camp. Nearly 3,000 people, including most of the children who had passed through Mengele's kindergarten during the previous 13 months, were taken to the gas chambers and killed that same night. According to testimony from several prisoners who worked in the sector hospital, 12 pairs of Roma twins whom Mengele still had under active study were alive that morning. Instead of sending them to the gas chamber with the rest of the sector, he killed them personally so their bodies could be dissected immediately, preventing the general liquidation process from interfering with preservation of the tissues he still considered useful. The anthropometric files, measurement records, and noma studies Mengele had accumulated on those same children became the only surviving record that they had existed. The playground with its carousel remained standing for several more weeks, empty, until it was dismantled along with the rest of the sector. In early January 1945, with the Soviet front less than a day's advance from Auschwitz, Mengele gathered his notes, anthropometric files, and remaining samples and took them with him during the evacuation that began on January 17. He did not wait for the general withdrawal orders issued to the rest of the camp administration. He left with part of his archive intact and abandoned in Birkenau the surviving twins and the Ovitz family, without instructions regarding what was to be done with them in a camp that within days would be effectively without guards. In the days before his departure, Mengele ordered his assistants to burn in a courtyard beside the sauna laboratory the files he did not intend to take with him. Prisoners working nearby later remembered dense smoke and the smell of burning paper mixing with the smoke already rising from the crematoria, and described seeing entire pages of anthropometric files, with photographs still attached, turning to ash within minutes. Taking advantage of the general confusion during the final days before evacuation, some prisoners managed to rescue a handful of folders from the fire and hide them among their belongings. Fragments that decades later would help historians reconstruct, however incompletely, the true scale of what had been lost that night. No one who witnessed the burning could later estimate how much material disappeared, or how many children's names vanished forever with the records that had documented them. What Mengele took with him that January was never published. No scientific paper bearing his name and presenting results obtained at Auschwitz ever appeared in a recognized medical journal, and experts who examined the surviving fragments of documentation after the war agreed that the material had no genuine scientific value. Samples were poorly preserved, experimental controls were non-existent, and many of the conclusions Mengele recorded in his files merely reflected the racial ideology he had intended to confirm before collecting a single piece of data. Ottmar von Verschwer himself, who had received years of shipments from Auschwitz for his Berlin Institute, publicly distanced himself from his former student as soon as the war ended and continued his academic career in West Germany without ever facing trial for his role in the operation. Mengele's name nevertheless appeared repeatedly in the courtrooms that did convene. Miklos Niisli published his first-hand account of Mengele's work shortly after the war, and that testimony became one of the sources German investigators later used to reconstruct the operation of the sauna laboratory. During the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, held between 1963 and 1965, Mengele's name appeared again and again in testimony from dozens of survivors describing the twins' barracks, even though the accused man himself was never present in court. Prosecutors gathered enough consistent testimony about his role in the House of Death and the sauna laboratory to include him among the principal figures responsible for the camp's medical system, a judicial recognition that could not result in an actual conviction without the defendant being physically present. A West German court issued an international arrest warrant, but by then Mengele had already spent more than a decade living under the protection of networks of German exiles in South America, changing residences whenever he suspected someone had discovered his whereabouts. Mengele himself was never captured. He lived under a false name in Bavaria for several years, crossed into Argentina in 1949 using documents obtained through escape networks organized for former Nazi officers, and from there moved to Paraguay and eventually Brazil, where he lived under various identities, always alert to any sign that he had been recognized and changing homes and names whenever the international press published a new unconfirmed sighting. He drowned in 1979 while swimming at a beach near Sao Paulo, still without having been identified by the authorities searching for him, and was buried under one of his false names in a local cemetery without those around him knowing who the man they had just buried really was. His remains were exhumed in 1985 and identified through dental evidence, and years later, genetic testing, formally closing a case that had remained open for 4 decades, without any court ever trying him for what he had done in Birkenau's twins' barracks. Ephraim Reichenberg never fully recovered his voice. Decades after the war, by then living outside Europe, he still required periodic medical treatment for the lasting effects of repeated injections into his throat, and specialists who reviewed his medical history in old age found scarring on his vocal cords consistent with precisely the kind of damage he had described since 1945. When he finally agreed to tell his story publicly many decades later, he did so accompanied by clinical notes from his own physicians, as though physical evidence were necessary to prove something that words alone no longer seemed sufficient to convey after so much time. His brother, whose singing talent had originally attracted Mengele's attention, never sang in public again. The Ovitz family, meanwhile, left Auschwitz together and intact, something none of Mengele's other experimental groups could say. After a period of recovery in a displaced persons camp, the siblings returned to the stage and resumed the musical repertoire that had made them known in Transylvania before the war. Eventually, they emigrated to Israel, where several lived to advanced age, recounting, when they agreed to do so, what they had witnessed in the barracks Mengele had specifically ordered built to keep them alive. Elizabeth Ovitz, the longest-lived of the 7 siblings with dwarfism, always insisted that their collective survival should not be understood as a story of luck, but as the precise and calculated result of the same scientific interest that had destroyed so many other entire families arriving on the same transports. The Red Army entered Auschwitz on January 27. In the children's block within Birkenau's hospital sector, Soviet soldiers found a small group of miners who had survived the emptying of the camp. Among them twins with injection marks still visible on their arms and necks, and the 7 Ovitz siblings, thin but alive, still able to identify one another as a family and to describe, in Yiddish and Hungarian, what they had endured during the preceding months in the barracks Mengele had ordered built for them. The first soldiers to enter the barracks stopped in the doorway for several seconds before approaching, unsure whether the children standing before them, their skin marked by needle punctures and clothing hanging loosely from their bodies, could even remain on their feet without assistance. Of the roughly 3,000 twins estimated to have passed through Mengele's experiments since May 1943, fewer than 200 walked out of Auschwitz alive. Eva Moses and her sister Miriam were among them. They left the camp holding hands, still wearing the striped clothing that marked them as prisoners, and with the injection scars fresh on their arms, walking toward a Soviet front that was only beginning to understand the scale of what it had just liberated.